Hey, this is David Wolinsky bringing you another interview from the audio archives of NoDon'tDie.com. This time I'm bringing to you the first half of my conversation with David Thomas, who's a former journalist, writer, critic, and was also the co-author of the first comprehensive video game journalism style guide. Nowadays, he's the director of academic technology at the University of Colorado, Denver, where academically he writes about fun, games, and technology. He and I spoke on March 15th, 2018, and just another quick reminder that you can read all the interviews I've been doing in the last few years over at NoDon'tDie.com. Also, you'll see a link to my Patreon, where your support helps me continue to do the work that I've been doing the last few years. And now, here's David Thomas.
Let me ask you one more question, though, before I babble on too much. I'm curious. I've been trying to get my own head around this, and I think it'll help us orient.
Sure.
At this point in time, when you look at games, are games this really unique part of our popular culture, our culture in general, or is it really that games were just the first thing that we noticed about this kind of new, I don't know, internet culture, whatever it's going to be? I guess I've never been. I was raised with games are special. And now I'm not sure that they're special. They may just be another facet of all the other shit that's going on. But I don't know, and I'd be curious how you look at that.
I think it's a good question. I think they're just a fact of life. I think they always have been. It's in the same way, like you mentioned with D&D. Like you're not going to get persecuted anymore for being into this stuff. But I think, even as we saw, as recently as last week, there are a lot of old stigmas that are still deep in the core of I think it's largely in the perception of games, because I don't think I've ever heard anyone inside of the culture or industry sort of link, any sort of real world behavior to being influenced or inspired by games. And the whole shootings thing is a whole other side topic. But I don't know. I know that there was for a long time almost like an exceptionalism of games. I've heard it be said to me in these interviews, and I've read this elsewhere. People are just sort of saying that video games have won. Everyone's a gamer. But I never really subscribed to it's all right, well, when were they losing, and what what did they win if they've won? What was at stake? They certainly were there was a lot of moral panic stuff back in the day, but I guess how can that both be true? How can they have won if they still are sort of routinely linked with shootings, or most people still think that they're just sort of embarrassing to take seriously. They're only allowed to be taken seriously in terms of revenue. I think just in terms of revenue, I think that's the only way that adults are allowed to sort of talk about how games are impressive.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think that they just sort of, I think they struggle themselves because they are still trying to chase being like movies. I think they just sort of don't know really what their identity is. So there's a lot of insecurity around that, and I think it would be better if people just admitted it rather than talk about how influential and important they are. Just some sort of measured and metered response. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I don't know. I wonder about it. I'll tell you this. All these years later, the whole Lester Bangs of game criticism was always to me, partly because I'm 100% sure that most people that said that never read a word Lester Bangs wrote, right?
Oh yeah, it's like the how blank is the Citizen Kane of video games. How most of those people probably never saw Citizen Kane.
Now, see, I was a rock writer before I was a game writer, and so I read these guys, and I probably read Bangs later than a lot of stuff, and what he was grappling with, in my opinion, he was grappling with this really fundamental question, which was, not just does rock and roll matter, but is rock and roll a special thing in culture, or is rock and roll just an aspect of this culture, right? I think he was asking that question I just asked you. And
Yeah.
I don't think he ever came to a conclusion. I think it killed him trying to figure it out. And it may just be the nature of this, but I think it helps sometimes to look at these kinds of
Hmm.
other media in context and think about, games that way, because but my confounding factor in thinking about games is really simple. Is it's like I guess when I was a little kid, the first game I ever remember seeing, the first video game I ever saw was a combat console at some hotel, right?
Hmm.
And it wasn't a vintage game. It was probably brand new, and I thought that was the coolest thing. I mean, I grew up with the arcade revolution. I grew up with personal computers. I mean, I grew up with all the
Yeah.
so I do so many phases of this, and then I got to be in the center of everything with the game journalism stuff. Straight from PlayStation 1 all the way through Xbox 360, and it was a crazy time. I mean, every year it was like your head was exploding.
Yeah.
And now I've got three kids, and the oldest is 19. And I got to tell you, that affects you because there's a certain point where I feel like, did games change or did I change? Right? Did it
Yeah.
get boring or did I just get old? And I think you'd ask the same question if you looked at rock and roll, right? Like the Rolling Stones shouldn't be playing rock and roll. That doesn't make any sense. But we said that was okay.
Yeah.
And I think games is in its own kind of adolescence and trying to figure out its role in culture versus its role as a media, so to speak.
I mean, so like two things, and then we can dive in. Like what I have found with this is because of the internet and filter bubbles and context smush or smash or whatever they call it, where you can't like understand the context where things were written and what they meant. What I have often found is with those types of big either or questions is the answer is it's simultaneously both.
Yeah.
And it really depends where you're looking and who you're talking to. And just because everyone around you is saying no doesn't, I mean, they may be right, but they just may not be aware that like, hey, something else is going on over there. And, that was actually like one of the things that, I mean, there was a couple of reasons why I started doing this. And one of them was that thing you mentioned of, why is it that games seem to lose their specialness for people, be it in terms of like they just sort of stop playing or because I've never heard of anyone, I mean, maybe reading books, but that's different, but like, oh, I just don't watch movies anymore. I don't listen to music anymore. I don't watch TV anymore. You don't really hear that, but you do hear like, oh, I stopped playing games.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I don't know why that is. I mean, there's practical reasons. Some people, have they're depressed or they go through where else and they realize like it's getting in the way of something else. But that may have just been them, not necessarily games. But I don't know. It's interesting stuff to ponder. And I mean, I would encourage you just sort of as we're going through this, please feel free to ask me whatever. So because I welcome it and I may not have any answers, but I can certainly respond and tell you what I remember that I've heard over the last few years.
Awesome. Well,
yeah,
listen,
man.
this is what, like 20 years ago, I got onto this whole video game thing,
Yeah.
it looked like fun, and I decided to take it seriously. And if a guy like you would have existed, you would have saved me a lot of trouble because I would have been able to bone up a lot more quickly.
Well, we'll see. Hopefully, I won't disappoint you. But that's really kind of you to say. I mean, I'm still learning from 200 plus of these, but that's kind of you to say. So just to sort of get us started for
Sure.
people who don't have a context for you, can you just sort of say your first and last name, your age, where in the world you're based out of, and just talk a little bit about your experience of writing about games or being around video games professionally?
Yeah, sure. So I'm David Thomas. I am 52. I live in Denver. I've lived in Denver since 1982. I graduated from Columbine High School, which has always been a peculiar piece of history, long before the violence, but culturally nothing ever really changed. Being from Denver has been great. Denver is a big little city. I mean, it has all the qualities of a big city, but it's pretty small. It's afforded me lots of opportunities, including breaking into the journalism area here. So I worked for the college paper in Fort Collins and Then I did some internships for some small papers around. But I ended up, the short version is I ended up writing for the two big dailies in Denver at the time, the Rocky Mountain News, rest in peace, and the Denver Post, Walking Dead. It might as well be dead at this point in time. But the only reason I would kind of to mention that Denver really plays into the history because I've always been kind of like in this interstitial space, right? Like I came of age as a journalist right at the time that the internet was poised to destroy journalism. So like blogging had sort of started. I had a blog early on. Like I was on one of these top 5% of the internet because there probably were only 100,000 sites on the internet. So it was kind of this interstitial age. I wasn't in the classic age of journalism, nor did I grow up in the frothy kind of blogosphere that what it kind of blew up into. And then Denver itself, it's kind of stuck in the middle. I mean, it's like a big city, but it's not a big city. And so when I got into the game industry, writing about games, I was always an anomaly. I really, truly was one of the first people working for a mainstream daily newspaper that had regular coverage about video games. There might have been a couple, but they were few and far between. And it was fascinating because on one hand, the PR companies were very excited to deal with me because I looked like their doorway to mom and pop. But at the second time, they couldn't care less what I wrote because I didn't sell games, right? I mean, they wanted to be on the front of Game Informer or Edge or, EGM or whatever. And so the other piece, I think, of this kind of interstitial nature, not only being in between these moments of journalism and kind of geographically in these different places and kind of even in the journalism market, sort of, I'm at a mainstream paper, but I'm writing about this genre stuff, so they didn't know where I fit. I've never been a full-time newspaper guy. I've always done it kind of as a side gig. I've been fortunate. I've written for 2 daily newspapers. I've written for tons of magazines, online sites, all kinds of stuff, but I've never done it full time. So today, this is the end of my bio, I am a faculty member and the director of academic technology at the University of Colorado, Denver. So that's my day job. I mean, I'm a technology guy and an academic. And in this day and age, at this point in time, I don't really consider myself much of a journalist. I think I've almost retired from that. I mean, I still do plenty of writing, but I don't do what you do anymore. I miss it, but I don't think I have the fire for it anymore.
Well, there is a lot to dive into there, but I am always fascinated by, because that's sort of, I feel like I tunneled in backwards. Like I started as an editor at an alt weekly, the Onion AV Club, and started writing about games 15 years ago, something like that. Mm-hmm. All my coworkers just thought it was really weird and dorky and stupid, but would want to borrow whatever stuff I was being sent. But I always find it interesting to talk to people who came up not writing for the enthusiast sites, and so I'm wondering, what was sort of the wisdom that your editors or bosses had in like guiding and supporting your writing about games? Like what were they interested in, and what were they not interested in?
Yeah, I mean, I realize I'm committing this to the public record, but it's a series of steps that all make sense when you hear the steps. I actually got hired by the Rocky Mountain News, and this is so long ago I don't remember the dates. It's probably early '90s, to write a column about local music. And I had a background in doing that, and so I wrote a weekly column for the big daily newspaper in Denver, local music. In a certain sense, the best job in the world, because these bands were thrilled to death to get into the newspaper because these kids read the alt weeklies, but they would get the clip and they'd give it to their parents, so their parents would feel like their parents would read about their kids in the paper. And I was a part of that era of movement where newspapers wanted to attract quote unquote younger readers. So I was the quote unquote young guy writing about this. For a bunch of reasons. Some were arrogance and attitude, and some of them were I just wasn't being taken seriously. I didn't feel. After like 5 years at the Rocky, I went to the Denver Post. I jumped ship. And the Denver Post basically said, we want you to be our young guy that writes about whatever cool things young people want to read about. So I had a column for 3 or 4 years called Alternatives. This was, yes, the era of the alternative, music or whatever. Right. So it was like local bands plus cool local art plus just really whatever. I mean, I write about anything. They didn't care. They thought it was all fascinating. I wrote about. I was basically like the alt weekly guy on the newspaper, so I could write
Right.
about anything. And as you know, within the parameters of not being anything too weird, they loved it. And then I think that had kind of run its course, and I was getting a little bit bored with it. And at this point in time, the internet's getting to be a big deal, and so I say, "Hey, I want to write this column called cyberculture." Right? And they're like, "What's cyberculture?" And I'm like, "It's arts, entertainment, and computers wherever they meet." And they're like, "That sounds great." Because at the time, there's a movie critic, doesn't write anything about anything to do with digital. There's a music critic, doesn't write about Napster or anything digital. There's a TV critic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in the back of my mind, I thought this is kind of a neat way to write about video games. Because that'd be fun to write about video games. So I'd write about a little bit about video games, and mostly computer games, right? There wasn't a lot of video game action right then. And so the long story short is I did that for a couple of years, and little by little, as the internet blew up, the rock guy started writing about Napster, the movie guy started writing about digital effects, the TV person started writing about, online streaming, programming. And I stopped writing about those subjects out of beat respect and just kept writing more and more about video games. At a point in time, cyberculture was just a video game column. So I went to them and said, why don't I just write a video game column? And they said, sounds good to us. And that was the entire negotiation. So I wrote about video games for the Denver Post for, I don't know, 10 years or something.
Yeah.
And toward the end of it, as the paper was kind of coming unglued and financial pressure and everything, I got picked up by King Features, and I had a syndicated game column. So the Denver Post bought the column from King Features for a fraction of what I had been charging them for it. So I sort of stuck around even a little longer just because I was really not a big expense for them, although my affiliation was always with the Denver Post. So so that really, I think I wrote down the timelines in some email, but that really took me through the middle of the 90s into the middle of from the early 2000s into 2010, 2011 or something.
Right. Well, it being a technology-based field, I think people are always sort of talking about what's around the corner, what's coming, what's next. Although I guess Rolling Stone does that too. All magazines tend to do that. What do you remember people being fixated on in those days or excited about? Was it like the interactive movie stuff back then, or what was it?
Yeah, in this certain sense, the great thing about mainstream news is that it tracks pretty closely with what you remember. At the time, Myst was the big deal, right?
Yeah.
And so it was kind of like CD-ROM stuff was really a big deal. And then, nobody remembers it now, but when the PlayStation 1 came out, it was a novelty, right? Nobody had any idea. Crash Bandicoot was well known as a game, as a figure, but I don't think a lot of people. It just seemed like it was an expensive children's toy. And so I really think that there was just there's just more cool stuff. Oh, there's a new Mario game. Oh, there's a new console coming out. People were super interested in sports games, but you know what? The first sports game that I remember making any big difference was I think it was the NBA Y2K. And some of the early 3D Madden games. Those are these games that all of a sudden, quote unquote, mainstream people got really interested. But I don't remember anyone being really, really on fire about video games until Wii Sports. And for me, that was probably this kind of cultural point where, as a writer who'd been, like you say, the dorky guy that everybody just borrows games from, all of a sudden everyone was just like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. You're so lucky to be a part of this.
Yeah.
And I think after that, then it really enters this era of being a lot like it is today, where people care about their genres. They know what the big games are. Oh, you're gonna get Call of Duty XXX, whatever it would be, and they were all excited about that. So I don't think there's anything really special about that. But again, I guess in retrospect, it happened so goddamn fast.
Yeah.
You used to go to E3 every year because it was going to be something you'd never seen before was going to happen. And there was a period of, I don't know, 5 or 6, probably about 8 years, really right around, because the jump from PS1 to PS2 was mind-blowing, right? The Dreamcast was cool, but the PS2 was just like, oh my gosh, And then the Xbox came out, and and it did more things, and then just it snowballed, and then it stalled out after I think probably around PS3, Xbox 360. It was just like everything was in HD. You had real shadow rendering. The graphics looked pretty good. It was sort of like nothing was ever quite as exciting after that, in my opinion. In terms of, if you look at the logarithm of hyperbole, things were better. It just didn't seem like they were getting better because they weren't getting better as fast.
Well, I think like one of the main through lines, things that I, when we were introduced, things I was thinking about and things that I was hoping to talk to you about sort of fall under the header of just sort of that sort of acceleration you're talking about, of sort of games catching on in a more mainstream way. And so you didn't mention this up top, but there's this book and this association that you were involved with. And so, the book was, what is that, like 11 years ago now?
Under the game journalism style guide.
Video game style guide and reference manual.
Yeah.
So I guess like just to sort of broadly get us into it, can you talk about sort of what inspired that, and in a non-academic way, no offense, why does the language of the usage of language around video games matter, period?
Well, let's get to the human motives. I'm describing myself in this interstitial space. I don't know how to put it any other way. It's just like, writing about video games probably still is, but it certainly was a lot like being in junior high school. It was very level intensive. Like, what parties did you get invited to? What did you get? What kind of swag did you get? What interviews were you getting? Mm-hmm. And so there's always this striving. And for the most part, the striving was pointless, because it was really just a matter of how big was the outlet you wrote for, right? But there was this jockeying, and I combined an actual background in kind of mainstream journalism, kind of editing, ethics, check your sources, all these things. There just was absent in this kind of, rough and tumble enthusiast press. So I always was kind of like, well, hey, I'm going to bring my professionalism to video game journalism. That's just what it needs. But underlying that was really an attempt to sort of carve out some space for myself, to be known for something, to be somebody that people wanted to talk to, and not just someone that people felt sorry for. So I with many years behind me, I can say it had more to do with wanting to be recognized than really wanting to do the Lord's work for journalism. Scott Steinberg's an interesting guy. He's an entrepreneur. He's a hustler. He's got 10 different projects going at once. I met him. We got on. He wanted to help make this happen. Kyle Orland was a young journalist. He kind of had a similar kind of situation as me. He was trying to, build his own, portfolio, and was very interested in this. And we just recognized, especially Kyle and I, having, he worked for NPR or for the Denver Post. You operate under the rubric of a style guide, and there just wasn't one for game journalism. And the big question was video games, one word or two. So Scott and Kyle,
we still haven't answered that question.
Yeah, Scott and Kyle flew to Denver for a weekend, and we sat down and we put together as many terms as we could think of, and then we spent the next several months just going through and defining them and doing stuff that we all just wished existed, like a list of game titles, because you'll always be like, okay, Pokemon, I know it's got that little accent mark, but where does it go, and which way does it go, forward or back? Or, oh, geez, when was the first Metal Gear Solid? And remember, the internet existed, but it wasn't as comprehensive as it is now, So some of this just having in a book was going to make life easier. So we threw all that together. And I had, set up this International Game Journalists Association, again, partly because I wished it existed, but part because I thought, here's a place that I can, kind of bring what I do to this crazy thing, and maybe, get more a part of it. And we put the book out, and I can tell you, at the time, Dan Shu was the editor at EGM. He was such an advocate for the book. He used it. I know you said you worked at Crispy Gamer. Elise at Crispy, she used it. She and Ryan used it as the style guide for a lot of this stuff. Mm-hmm. So it actually had an impact. And Kyle and I always talked about putting another edition out, and I just, it hasn't happened, and I don't know why. I wish someone would do it, because it was really actually pretty useful. But that's the style guide, and that's why. And if you want to pin that to something culturally, I mean, I think at least for me, it was probably a combination of being ego driven and also a desire to see some professionalism. And the fact that that kind of work never went forward should tell you something about what happened to journalism, not necessarily what happened to game journalism.
Went forward. How do you mean?
It didn't go forward. I mean, there's
That's
never.
that's what I mean by not going forward. Like what would it going forward have looked like, or what are you imagining?
Well, I think that somebody else would have picked it up and kept working on it. AP should have just called us and said, "Hey, we think this is great. Can we just absorb it as a supplement?" I mean, but no, but I guess what I'm saying is nobody really cared. I mean, there were some really funny arguments about video games, one word or two. Some people found it really useful. The website
Yeah.
used to get a fair amount of traffic, but when it went away, I think it got replaced by the internet, right? It, you know,
Wikipedia and
Wikipedia, right, and in-house style guides. I mean, but I used to write for. When was the last time somebody they don't even tell you video game one word or two. They just change it to whatever they want.
I just sort of decided I'm probably a bad person because when I write for other people, I always make sure it's two. On this project, it's one, and I'm not sure that it was a conscious choice at some point. And then, as you know, with style, this type of style, writing style, not fashion,
Yeah,
you just sort of stick to it, and you just have it in your bones. And then years later, you get annoyed when you find out they repeal some rule that you had to learn really hard to remember.
yeah,
Um,
well,
but it's funny because I talked with Henry who connected us. We
yeah,
talk about blind spots that appear in civilian historians sort of underdoing sort of you know uh, their own documentation just on YouTube, or certainly what I'm doing here is a form of
yeah.
well, I guess it's sort of citizen journalism, although I am a journalist. But you talk about doing something similar with this association and with this book, and I guess I'm curious from your experience of the internet or your experiences, because I know that you had some events as well. I mean, what do you think people don't realize about the work that goes into trying to do this type of work, and even like what slips through the cracks by people not even making this effort?
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember having a conversation with Jason Della Rocca years ago. Jason at the time was the chief executive of the International Game Developers Association, and so he would always give me advice on this. And he says any of these kind of membership groups, they have the problem of the commons, right? That if I spend all this time making the game journalist style guide, everyone gets the benefit whether they contribute to it or not. So you have this free rider problem. And I think with the IGDA, even though it was sort of motivated by my own selfish needs, it still is just kind of, I couldn't find enough other people that saw a value in it to put effort into it. The events that we held a party, I think, for 2, 3 party / get together at some GDCs and some E3s. And it was
Right.
good to get people together. I mean, we ran a blog with the discussion group. I think the discussion group largely was used for people to get roommates at GDC and E3, which was great. I met a bunch of people through that. So, but yeah, I mean, it was thankless work. At the end of the day, I probably would have had to keep doing it for 10 years, and then I would have got some lifetime achievement award somewhere. Um, and
Yeah.
I just I don't want to sound disrespectful to my fellow game journalists, but I kind of understand why they didn't care, right? I mean, most of these kids were. They were just thrilled they got a free gaming platform and got flown across the country to drink free booze with you know young women. I mean, they were like as happy as they could be. They didn't care if it was video game one word or two. Um, and,
Right.
and so there's a certain sense it was like I don't know how you professionalize something. I don't. I probably just failed is probably as easy as any way to say it.
Well, I think you mentioned a lot of this is the internet impacting journalism, and it's true that as that has happened, there hasn't been a business model that's emerged. I mean, if you're saying people don't care about a style guide, I can't tell you how many people in their early 20s that I talk to who want to do this sort of work. I don't even think they get edited, so I don't even think, you know what I mean? Like, why? What use would they have for a reference guide
You got
when they're
right.
basically just publishing it straight up anyway?
Yeah, and that may have something to do with it too. At the same time, I'll tell you, I'm immensely proud of that work, and I'm glad that it hasn't completely faded from history, because I will tell you, if nothing else, it is a very clear-headed point in time picture of what games looked like then. I mean, just in terms of who's in the appendix, like who did we say are notable names, right? I mean,
Hmm.
we weren't complete and total, novices. I mean, these are the names that we had to spell check because we wrote about them every week. The games, the terms, these are the terms. And I mean, like, one thing that I can point to is really specifically is, at the time there was that question about fun factor, right?
Yeah.
And fun factor was going out, and so we kind of have to wrestle a little bit with the term fun, and we kind of are just a little bit dismissive on it. I don't think people even remember some of the context that's in there, talking about, oh, this Nintendo magazine used to use fun factor. It was really present in the minds of writers at that point in time. So, as a historical document, I think it's probably really useful to help people understand a little bit about what it might have been like to be a game writer at that point in time. But, I'm short of Kyle getting a real strong desire to update it. I probably won't do it myself. I would
Hmm.
love to work on the project if somebody else wants to do it.
What do you think? What do you feel has changed? I mean, just sort of off the top of your head, gut reaction thing. What seems to have changed about game industry, game culture, games writing, since this document was made?
Yeah, the single biggest thing that changed is that game journalists got disintermediated. Um, you used to need game journalists to get the message out to the game players, because they bought magazines, and or they went to certain websites, or they read sometimes newspapers. Um, but, like, game magazines are gone, right? Writing about games in newspapers is basically all but gone. And now, I understand that there's game websites. I mean, sure, there's Polygon, great. I mean, wonderful. It's a nice site. But
Hmm.
if I want to know what Activision's doing, where do I go? I just go to YouTube, right? I mean, I just go watch stuff. There's 50 kids that are talking about it, or I think that it's as simple as we used to be an important part of the game industry machine, and now we're not. And so it's that's it.
Yeah, I had a question about that exactly, which is I think you were actually talking about my uh, interview with Gus, where just how one day you sort of realized doing this type of work, it's not worth what you're getting paid, and I'm sure you remember the succession of headlines a couple of years back of like the millionaire streamers and people making millions of dollars playing games. I mean, I guess there's two questions in here, and one is, um, if two if two journalist types can talk about this without seeming like we're being nostalgic or overly precious or sorry for ourselves. I mean, what do you feel like is damaged, or we don't get as much of a view on, as we've gotten disintermediated. I think that's a word, and it's just going to streamers, because I feel like inevitably, what happened to us will happen to them. It's not a permanent solution to just be on YouTube. Even just in the last year or two, they've changed how monetization works, and it's upset people. But just in that passing of the torch, what do you think has suffered?
I mean, the simple answer is analysis, and I think that's kind of the grown up word. But it's funny, right? I mean, if you think about, like, Henry Jenkins's whole idea of participatory culture, right? That sort of says, hey, this is awesome. Now we don't have to be fed from above by gatekeepers. We can produce media, and we can all be in conversation. And I don't just mean game writing. I mean political discourse, arts discourse, anything. So I think it's awesome that a 14-year-old kid can have a million people watching him or her's opinions about a video game, right? Why is
Hmm.
my opinion so much more valuable just because I used to write for a newspaper that served hundreds of thousands of people? It's not. But the demands. We used to talk about the news hole, right? The news hole. You got to fill the news hole.
Yeah, yeah.
Now it's the news black hole, right? It's like these kids are literally turning on their webcam and just talking the first thing off the top of their head, and then editing out the and then they're publishing it, and analysis suffers then, right? And then what I believe this, I don't know if it's true, but I believe that we have created a culture of quick consumption. Should I buy the new Assassin's Creed game? Yeah, it's awesome. You get to fly, you get to do this, blah blah blah. But then nobody ever slows down long enough to just be like, well, how does this change our perception of history? Is this good or bad? I mean, are we changing
Mm-hmm.
our notions of race and the kind of work that I see you doing? And I like to read that stuff. And there's almost no place for it anymore because people they've already gone down the road. And in fact, I'll give you a quick example. This is probably the point. This is one of two steps to the end of my game journalism career. There was a story, and I looked it up. I don't know when it was, but it was 4 or 5 years ago. There was this kid who posts on a discussion group that he wants to sell his collection of like 180 Steam games. You might remember this.
Yeah.
Valve finds out about this and bans him. Just out of hand bans him, right? This explodes onto the internet. How could Valve be so bad? Da da da, all this stuff. I mean, like for a 3-day news cycle, it dominates the blogs and then it's gone. I'm working for EGM at the end by then. I go through the hard work of, first of all, identifying who this kid is. Second of all, I spent about a week convincing him to talk to me on the phone. So I finally get him on the phone, right? I talk to him. I get the whole story. You get the background. He's this poor kid, like lives with his mom. I mean, it's just really an interesting, story. And he's just like, I didn't know I wasn't, So I write the story up. But by the time the story gets into print, it's like, I don't know, 6 weeks later.
Yeah.
Nobody cares. Nobody cares what actually happened. Nobody cares
Yeah.
to find out that Valve actually worked it out with him. Nobody cares. And I think that, that's so when the news cycle's that fast, what happens to analysis? Nobody wants to read your analysis of a game that came out a month ago. And that kills me, I guess. I think that's hurting it as a medium or as a cultural form, but that's what's bad.
I mean, do you think because I've obviously, maybe not obviously, but I have, of course, run into that with my wanting to sculpt down things from each of these interviews, from some of these interviews, and organize them into, hey, I have a story here about a trend or about a thing, or it relates to something that's going on. And there is inevitably, because I am more interested in going to a more mainstream outlet, I'm interested in taking this stuff to people who wouldn't otherwise be exposed to it. There is that two-pronged problem of a lot of this stuff, I think, suffers due to newsworthiness and timeliness. And then it also suffers from just difficulty of getting buy-in because it's about games. And so do you think, like, with the stuff that you're talking about, is that a media culture problem, or is it a game culture problem, or is it, like I said before we started, is it probably both, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, it really goes back to that question that in some sense it really seems to be attenuated in games.
Yeah.
But I think it may just be a part of the culture. I mean, if you've been reading about this Donald Trump guy for the last year, it's the same problem, and
I've heard a little bit.
But isn't it fascinating that like you almost feel like they've stored up things in case there's a slow Trump news day,
Which they.
Well, it doesn't even stand to reason that he could do something crazy every single day of the week, but that seems to be what happens. And I don't know if it really is truly he's just this extraordinary, person for doing all this, or if it's something about how we perceive it, right? That one day he's almost starting a nuclear war. That's kind of newsworthy. And the next day, oh, here's an old story about a porn star, and we can't even see the fact that they're not the same thing.
Right. Or his son is getting divorced now, or take your pick.
Yeah. So games may have always just kind of naturally fallen into whatever was top of mind seemed like it was way more important than what happened yesterday.
Yeah.
But it's a good question. I don't know.
I don't know that there's an answer. I mean, I just know from talking to, however many different outlets where they I mean, they don't want to be caught not being the ones covering whatever because they want the traffic, or maybe that's a cynical read on things. I don't think so, but I will talk to people who would be potential editors for pieces for me, and they will say yes. They really want to have some respite. They want to cover something else, but then immediately they run into, well, why would a general reader care about this? Or they don't have the time, or there's not the budget to necessarily like actually work with you on, because I think there is some stuff from games industry, from games culture, that is a little more, that can connect with people in a more meaningful way than how the new Tomb Raider movie did, or the Curse of video game movie adaptations. I think that like it is still stuck in this role that it has played for decades and decades, and maybe it just doesn't bother people because there are so many more people playing now. But if so many more people were playing now, then there should be the ability for more journalism about it. I don't know. I'm accessing that part of my brain where it's like, it's this weird catch-22 where I feel like it's a very small problem that only a very few amount of people in the world like even understand. Because I think most people would just go to an enthusiast site and write some version of it there. But I would guess, you being, like you said, sort of like the odd man out, alt weekly dude at a paper, or someone who was moved to write a reference guide, that I feel like this would make sense to you, sort of what I'm saying, I think, maybe.
It does, and to the extent that perhaps this is a bigger phenomenon than just games. I mean, have you seen this thing they're doing on Huffington Post called Highline?
What is that?
I've read a couple things. Basically, they're picking these like long form topics and kind of letting the writer go with it, and it makes me think that there are other people in the world that lament this the hype cycle of the internet black hole news hole, and it makes me just wonder if people like myself gave up too soon, and I really should have stuck to my guns and really tried to encourage this idea of professionalism in the face of derision and mockery of my fellow game journalists, because maybe that's the problem, is that I'll say this. I'm 100% sure that Gamergate has one of its sources in game journalism, and not just because of how it started, but because game journalists cultivated very, very carefully the Gamergate taste, and then was sort of shocked when they found out that it was an abhorrent thing. And this goes back to this idea that that game journalists probably should have done more, and maybe still can do more, to take games seriously in and of themselves, and not just say, we want other people to take games seriously, aka put them in art museums, aka give them First Amendment protections, aka sell them to minors in Best Buy or whatever we think makes them credible cultural objects. And instead, game journalists should be spending more time saying, slow down. We really should be asking deeper questions about what does this mean. And
right.
The thing I would tell you that probably I'm way off kind of mainstream on this. When the games and violence debate cropped back up,
yeah,
Facebook feed starts responding from my academic and journalism friends with, we know there's no cause, we know there's no correlation, this knee-jerk reaction, and I find myself going, hang on a second. Why do we get a free pass? Why do on A we say we are important cultural objects, and B, but we have no cultural influence whatsoever? And I find myself really, really estranged from the notion that games boosterism is more important than actually thinking about what does it mean to live in a world where the best-selling games are about shooting people.
I think it's gotten. I think that's a side effect of the whole output. Getting a free pass or just being overlooked. I mean, a lot is really pinned on the revenue, how much a game has made, how many customers it has. There's been this sort of there's been this lack of interest, other than blaming video games from the mainstream, of that taking them seriously, and not necessarily like elevating them to be something more than they are, but just, not having an agenda, just considering them on their own terms. And that was actually something I wanted to ask you about is, I mean, what do you feel like is, I mean, I guess you sort of touched on this. I mean, talking about sort of like what the mainstream may get wrong about video games, but in mainstream journalism about video games, I mean, what would you like to be able to read that you feel like no one ever writes about?
Well, I mean, I'm not trying to just, blow smoke, but I mean, some of the stuff that I read of yours on Medium, I like that kind of stuff,
Oh, thank you.
I mean, I have a ton of respect for Gus, partly because he's just such a wonderful freak, and he's been such a generous person with his time and his attention to my weird little projects over the years. But deep down, I think Gus is the kind of guy that if they would just give him some time and some space and give him some money, he'd like to write some really thoughtful things, and he has. Most of the people I know that were interested, willing, or able to do this kind of work kind of phased out of it. There just wasn't a place for them. And that's okay. I'm not saying that there's a holy, school of game analysis, but I do think that people should be willing to just take a step back and just write about it and think about it. And by the way, one of my favorite journalists of all time is Chuck Klosterman, and I know some people aren't wild about him, but I think he's a wildly entertaining writer, but he's a really insightful cultural critic, right? And I think even Klosterman's having trouble finding a venue for his stuff these days. So maybe it's bigger than games, but I would like for people to be able to sit down and just chew over a question that I haven't even got time to think of, right?
I mean, I think a lot of this ties in with some of the intent behind your book, because I feel like people look at games, people who didn't grow up with them, people who weren't moved to write about them, people who just, they're consumers of them and fans of them. I don't think that even they realize how much of video games is tied up in lingo, of how much of it is like a a secret language. Like if you were to look at whatever the most popular shooter is, and you look at it next to a screenshot of not the most recent Metal Gear game, but the one before it, the last Hideo Kojima one. I mean, the average person isn't going to know that, like, oh, this is actually an anti-war game, and that one's,
Right.
I guess, warmongering game. I mean, how do you feel that, like, the limited vocabulary of games that we have even today, like, how does that sort of block entry for more people, and not necessarily just, editors who would give us assignments, but just like on a deeper human level? Like, how do you think the language we have keeps people, gated, basically?
I'm glad you brought that back. I mean, you keep asking me that, and I just kind of keep dodging on it. But
No, it's okay. I mean, I don't know that has an answer, to be fair.
Well, I kind of realize that it's just like I'm not talking about a really critical part of my own past, which is I've been interested in game vocabulary from the very beginning, in part because, it came out of rock and roll. I used to write movie reviews, and there's already some critical vocabulary there. And there just wasn't really any good critical vocabulary in games. And it's evolved. And I remember Matt Saki wrote this, this article about it years ago on Gama Sutra, which was really good. And Greg Kostikian had this great thing, I have no words, yet I must design. So it turns out that not having that vocabulary, it affects design. It affects the potential for how you can build games. It affects the kinds of games that you can talk people up to about, so what kinds of games they play, about the kinds of players and the kind of player sensibilities. And I mean, you think about it, it's just like if your entire vocabulary for film was based on what you could observe in Three Stooges movies, it wouldn't prevent you from doing other things, but it would definitely steepen the curve, right? It would make
It might limit you somewhat, yeah.
But yeah, you just naturally would have a hard time envisioning a love story, or even a grand war movie. You just wouldn't be able to do it. And I swear to God, all these years later, I don't think video games have evolved very much on that front. And it's one of the reasons why indie or AAA, they're all kind of the same.
Yes.
And so flash forward now, all these years later, I just finally finished this book with John Sharp. He's a professor of game studies at Parsons. And the book's called Fun Taste in Games, and it's an aesthetics book, and it argues that there's this native aesthetics to game anchored in fun. And so we're trying to do some of the hard intellectual work of establishing a game as an aesthetic for games. And I know this is like super academic-y and it's not gonna, it's not gonna change the world or anything. But after all these years, it's the first piece of work that I feel like that I've accomplished to sort of say, okay, we're making some steps towards understanding what makes games an object of attraction. Now maybe we can start building some design language on top of that. And I'm not a game designer, so it's not going
Yeah.
to be me. But I kind of feel like we need to get there. And if you read Henry and Rayford's debugging game history book, you'll see I've got the chapter on fun. And the whole nut of it is that we need this word, and yet nobody wants to talk about it, much less journalists. And so here I am remediating the game vocabulary problem one word at a time, right? I'll never get done with fun, but I just want to say you're 100% right. We should take the way we talk about games seriously, and we've evolved past fun factor, and we understand interaction a little bit better, and we understand adaptive leveling and adaptive difficulty, and we understand these things better, but I still don't think we quite. I think we're still in the embrace or the thrall
Hmm.
of the narrative beauty models. I mean, the traditional media, and in the academic world, it was the narratology versus ludology debate. But it basically just says, are games like games, or games like movies, or games like books, and different
Yeah.
people have different opinions, and it turns out that that's the wrong question to ask, because games can be very book-like or very movie-like or very non-book and non-movie like, and very sports-like. But you got to understand what the underlying aesthetic is that John and I are calling this fun taste and games framework. But I think that then you start to build some words. And I don't know. We probably need some really cool words, and we're missing them. We
Well,
really are.